Don't just watch in the dark. Click subscribe, like, and join now. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? The secret without a name. The cold was biting, and the silence of Anchorage's streets at 2 a.m. felt unnatural. Amelia Mitchell pulled her coat tighter around herself as she hurried down a dimly lit sidewalk. The snow crunched under her boots, each step echoing in the stillness like an unwelcome intrusion. She shouldn't have been out here this late, but something about the call from Sophia Miller had made her stomach churn, a desperate voice pleading for help before the line went dead. Amelia's breath came out in visible puffs, quickening with every second that passed. Her gloved hands tightened around the strap of her bag as she turned onto Sophia's street. It was eerily empty, the kind of emptiness that didn't feel right even for a place buried deep in winter. Streetlights flickered above, casting long shadows on the snow-covered ground. The houses here were mostly dark, their windows staring blankly into the night, except for one, a faint light glowed behind closed curtains at the end of the block. That must be it, she thought, her heart pounding harder now. Sophia lived alone, always insisting she liked the quiet solitude of Anchorage winters. But tonight, there was no answer when Amelia knocked on the door. She tried again, louder this time, her knuckles rapping against the wood with urgency. "Sophia? Are you there?" Only silence greeted her, broken only by the distant hum of power lines swaying in the wind. She reached for her phone to call again, but just as her thumb hovered over the screen, she heard it a faint creak from inside the house. It wasn't enough to dismiss as settling wood, it carried weight, purpose. Amelia hesitated, then pressed her ear closer to the door. Another sound followed, softer but unmistakable, shuffling footsteps, moving away from where she stood. "Sophia?" she called again, her voice trembling. No response. Just the oppressive silence pressing back against her words. Then, without warning, the doorknob began to turn slowly. So slowly, it seemed deliberate. Amelia stumbled backward, nearly slipping on the icy steps leading up to the porch. Her pulse roared in her ears as the door swung open wide, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. There was no one there, not immediately anyway. But as Amelia forced herself to peer inside, she noticed something odd, a trail of wet footprints leading further into the house. They weren't hers. They couldn't be. She hadn't stepped inside yet. And they weren't fresh either, not entirely. Some parts of the prints gleamed with melted snow, while others looked older, partially dried and smeared as if someone or something had walked through days ago but left traces that refused to fade. Against her better judgment, Amelia stepped inside. The warmth of the house hit her instantly, though it brought little comfort. Something about the air felt wrong, stale, heavy, as if it hadn't circulated properly in weeks. She glanced around the living room, taking in the familiar clutter of books and photographs scattered across shelves. Everything seemed normal, until she saw the photo frame lying face down on the coffee table. She picked it up cautiously, turning it over. It was a picture of Sophia smiling brightly next to Jackson Cole, her boyfriend or ex-boyfriend, depending on who you asked. Their faces were scratched out violently, gouges cutting through the glass like angry scars. A chill ran down Amelia's spine. This wasn't random vandalism. Someone had done this deliberately, methodically. Before she could process what it meant, another noise caught her attention, a low scraping coming from somewhere deeper in the house. It sounded like nails being dragged along a hard surface, slow and rhythmic, punctuated by pauses that somehow felt more menacing than the sound itself. Amelia swallowed hard, clutching her phone tightly in her hand. She considered calling the police, but what would she say? That she broke into her friend's house because of some creepy noises? They'd think she was crazy. Instead, she moved cautiously toward the hallway, following the sound despite every instinct screaming at her to leave. The hallway was narrow, lined with family portraits that seemed to watch her as she passed. Each frame held a face frozen in time, eyes staring ahead as if waiting for something. At the far end, a door stood slightly ajar, light spilling out from within. The scraping grew louder, closer, and Amelia realized it was coming from behind that door. Her palms were slick with sweat beneath her gloves as she pushed it open just enough to peek inside. What she saw stopped her dead in her tracks. The room was small, cluttered with boxes stacked haphazardly against the walls. In the center sat a chair, and on the chair was Sophia, or at least what remained of her. Her body slumped forward unnaturally, head hanging limp as if her neck couldn't support its weight anymore. Blood pooled beneath the chair, dark and congealed, staining the hardwood floor. But the worst part was her face, or rather, the absence of it. Where Sophia's features should have been, there was only smooth, featureless skin stretched taut over bone. Amelia gagged, stumbling backward as bile rose in her throat. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. Instead, she froze, transfixed by the sight before her. And then, from somewhere behind her, a voice spoke softly, almost kindly. "You shouldn't have come." She spun around, heart hammering wildly, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, the portraits still staring silently ahead. Yet the voice lingered in her mind, repeating the same phrase over and over. "You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have come." Amelia backed away, tripping over her own feet as she tried to retrace her steps toward the front door. But the layout of the house seemed different now, distorted somehow. Doors that hadn't been there before appeared in the walls, leading to rooms she didn't recognize. Shadows shifted unnaturally, twisting into shapes that defied logic. She could hear whispers now too, overlapping voices murmuring in tones too low to understand. Panic set in fully as she realized she was trapped. Every step she took led her deeper into the labyrinthine nightmare of Sophia's home. The air grew colder with each passing moment, frost creeping up the walls and forming intricate patterns on the ceiling. And always, the whispers followed her, growing louder and more insistent. Finally, she found herself in a room she didn't remember entering. It was larger than any other space in the house, impossibly so, with walls made entirely of mirrors. Each reflection showed a version of herself, but none of them matched the person standing in the center of the room. Some looked older, gaunt, and hollow-eyed. Others appeared younger, innocent, and terrified. One reflection wasn't even human. It was a twisted, monstrous figure with elongated limbs and a mouth full of jagged teeth. Before she could react, the reflections began to move independently, stepping out of the mirrors and surrounding her. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, and they all spoke in unison, their voices blending into a single cacophony. "You know the secret," they hissed. "You've always known." Amelia shook her head frantically, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know anything," she screamed. But the figures only drew closer, their cold breath brushing against her skin. One of them reached out, its fingers brushing her cheek, and suddenly memories flooded her mind, memories that weren't hers. Images of Sophia, of Jackson, of secrets whispered in the dark, of a nameless thing lurking just beyond the edge of perception, waiting patiently for someone foolish enough to stumble upon it. And then everything went black. When Amelia woke, she was outside again, lying in the snow. The house was gone, replaced by an empty lot surrounded by trees. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she fumbled to retrieve it, hoping desperately for some explanation. There was a text message from an unknown number containing only 3 words: "Tell no one." She stared at the screen, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Somewhere in the distance, she heard laughter soft, childlike, and utterly devoid of joy. The whisper that never opened. It was 3 in the morning when Lucas Bennett first heard the sound. A faint whisper carried by the icy wind that swept through the narrow streets of Los Angeles. The city was unusually quiet for a place that never slept, its usual hum of life replaced by an unsettling stillness. Frost clung to the palm trees lining the sidewalks, their leaves glistening under the dim streetlights. Lucas had been walking home from his late shift at the diner when he noticed it, the whispering that seemed to follow him wherever he went. He pulled his jacket tighter around himself, trying to shake off the chill that wasn't entirely from the cold. The whisper grew louder as he passed an alleyway between 2 old brick buildings. It sounded like words, but nothing coherent, just fragments of syllables that danced at the edge of understanding. His pace quickened, boots crunching against the frost-covered pavement. He told himself it was just the wind playing tricks on him. but deep down, he knew better. Olivia Turner lived in apartment 3B of the building where Lucas rented his studio. She had moved in 6 months ago, and they had exchanged polite greetings in the hallway occasionally. But tonight, when Lucas finally reached his floor, he found her standing outside her door, her face pale and drawn. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with her keys, dropping them twice before managing to unlock the door. Something about her demeanor made Lucas pause. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice softer than intended. Olivia glanced at him, her eyes wide with something he couldn't quite place. Fear? Exhaustion? Both? She hesitated before answering, I keep hearing things." Her voice cracked slightly. Voices. Whispers. I thought maybe it was just my imagination. She trailed off, looking past him into the dark hallway. Lucas felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard those whispers too. Without thinking, he said, "Me too. Tonight. Outside." Olivia's expression shifted from fear to something closer to relief, though her hands still shook. "Come in," she said quietly, stepping aside. The warmth of her apartment enveloped him immediately, but it did little to ease the tension coiling in his chest. Inside, the room was small but cozy, decorated with mismatched furniture and soft lighting. A half-empty mug of tea sat cooling on the coffee table beside an open book. Olivia gestured for him to sit while she poured herself another cup. "Do you want some?" she asked, holding up the teapot. Lucas nodded, though he doubted anything could settle the unease growing inside him. As she busied herself in the kitchenette, he noticed the curtains were drawn tightly shut, despite the fact that no one would be able to see inside at this hour. The windows themselves seemed almost deliberately avoided. So Olivia began after handing him a steaming mug. "You heard them too, the whispers." It wasn't a question. Lucas took a sip of the tea. It tasted bitter, but he didn't complain. "Yeah, out there. They followed me all the way back here." He set the mug down carefully. "What about you? When did you start hearing them?" Olivia wrapped her fingers around her own mug, staring into its depths as if searching for answers. "A week ago. At first, I thought it was just stress or lack of sleep. You know how it is, working long hours, trying to make ends meet. But then it got worse." She looked up at him, her gaze piercing. "They started coming closer, louder. Like they were right behind me, even when I was alone in my apartment." Lucas swallowed hard. "Did you tell anyone? Call someone?" Olivia shook her head. "Who would believe me? My friends think I'm overreacting. My landlord thinks I'm making excuses to get out of paying rent next month." She let out a humorless laugh. "And honestly, who can blame them? If I hadn't heard it myself tonight, I might not have believed me either." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant hum of traffic far below. Lucas glanced toward the window, where shadows flickered faintly against the drawn curtains. Was it his imagination, or did the air feel colder now? He turned back to Olivia. "There has to be an explanation. Maybe it's some kind of electrical interference, or, I don't know, plumbing noise?" Even as he said it, the words sounded hollow. Neither of them believed it. Olivia leaned forward, lowering her voice. "There's something else. Last night, I saw someone or something standing outside my window. Just a figure, barely visible through the frost. It didn't move, just stood there, watching." Her breath hitched. "When I went to check, there was no one there. No footprints, nothing. But the feeling, it stayed with me. Like I wasn't alone anymore." Lucas felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He wanted to dismiss her story as paranoia, but the memory of the whispers he'd heard earlier lingered vividly in his mind. "Have you tried leaving? Going somewhere else for a few days?" She shook her head again. "I can't afford to leave. And besides," she hesitated, glancing toward the window once more, "it feels like it's following me. Wherever I go, whatever I do, it's always there, waiting." The weight of her words settled over them like a suffocating blanket. Lucas finished his tea, setting the empty mug aside. "We should figure this out together," he said finally. "Whatever it is, if it's real, we'll find a way to stop it." Olivia gave him a small, grateful smile, but her eyes remained haunted. Over the next hour, they talked about everything they could remember. The timing of the whispers, any patterns or triggers, whether they had noticed anything unusual in their daily routines. The conversation helped distract them temporarily, but neither could shake the sense that they were being watched. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind outside, sent jolts of adrenaline coursing through their veins. Eventually, Lucas realized he needed to get back to his own apartment. Reluctantly, he stood, thanking Olivia for the tea. She walked him to the door, her hand lingering on the doorknob. "Be careful," she whispered, "and if you hear anything again, don't go looking for it." He nodded, forcing a reassuring smile he didn't feel. "You too. Lock your door tight." With that, he stepped out into the hallway, closing the door softly behind him. For a moment, he stood there, listening. The whispers weren't audible now, but the oppressive silence felt just as menacing. Back in his studio, Lucas locked his door and double-checked the windows. He debated calling someone, anyone, but who would he call? Who would understand, without dismissing him outright? Instead, he lay down on his bed, staring at the ceiling as exhaustion slowly crept over him. Sleep came fitfully, plagued by dreams of shadowy figures and unintelligible voices echoing endlessly in his ears. The next morning brought little relief. Though the sun eventually rose, casting weak light over the frost-laden city, the oppressive atmosphere remained. Lucas called in sick to work, unable to face the idea of leaving his apartment. Around noon, there was a knock at his door. It was Olivia, carrying a bag of groceries and wearing a nervous smile. "I figured we could use some supplies," she said, stepping inside, "and maybe staying together will help." Lucas didn't argue. Together, they spent the day researching local legends, urban myths, anything that might explain what was happening. They scoured forums, read articles, even dug into old newspaper archives online. Most of it was nonsense ghost stories and conspiracy theories, but one thread caught their attention. A user named Silent Watcher had posted about a series of disappearances in Los Angeles during the winter months over the past decade. The cases were unsolved, dismissed as runaways or accidents, but certain details stood out. Witnesses reported hearing strange noises before the victims vanished. Some claimed to have seen shadowy figures lurking near windows or alleys. The posts were vague, but the similarities were impossible to ignore. As evening fell, the temperature dropped sharply. The heater struggled to keep up, and both Lucas and Olivia found themselves bundled in blankets, huddled together on the couch. The whispers returned, louder this time, seeping through the walls like water. They exchanged panicked looks, hearts pounding in unison. Whatever it was getting closer. Desperation drove them to action. Armed with flashlights and makeshift weapons, a baseball bat for Lucas, a kitchen knife for Olivia, they ventured into the hallway. The whispers surrounded them now, forming a cacophony of disjointed sounds that clawed at their sanity. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the air itself resisted their movement. At the end of the hallway, the emergency exit stood ajar, frost creeping inward. Beyond it lay the fire escape, descending into darkness. Lucas hesitated, gripping the bat tightly. "Do we really want to know what's out there?" he whispered. Olivia didn't answer, her eyes fixed on the gap. Slowly, they stepped through, bracing themselves for whatever awaited them. The metal stairs groaned under their weight, each step echoing ominously in the frigid night. Below, the alley was shrouded in shadow, the streetlights casting long, distorted reflections on the icy ground. Movement caught the corner of Lucas's eye, a flicker, gone before he could focus. Then another, and another. Shapes darted between the buildings, fleeting glimpses of something humanoid, yet wrong. "Run," Olivia hissed, clutching his arm. They bolted down the remaining steps, slipping on patches of ice as they fled. Behind them, the whispers erupted into a deafening roar, filling the air with chaotic sound. Shadows converged, twisting and writhing like living smoke. Panic surged through Lucas's veins as he realized they were being hunted. They rounded a corner, breaths ragged, legs burning. Ahead, a familiar figure emerged from the darkness. It was Benjamin Hayes, a neighbor whose face they recognized, but whose name they rarely spoke. His expression was blank, his movements mechanical. He raised a hand, pointing toward an abandoned warehouse across the street. "In there," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You'll find answers." Without hesitation, they obeyed, bursting through the rusted doors of the warehouse. Inside, the air was thick with decay and dampness. Faint traces of graffiti adorned the crumbling walls, remnants of a forgotten era. In the center of the vast space stood a wooden crate, its surface etched with symbols neither of them recognized. Above it hovered a swirling mass of darkness, pulsating rhythmically like a heartbeat. Olivia approached cautiously, her knife trembling in her grip. "What is this?" she murmured, reaching out. Lucas grabbed her wrist, pulling her back. "Don't touch it," he snapped. But it was too late. The moment her fingers brushed the crate, the world around them dissolved into chaos. Images flooded their minds, faces screaming silently, hands clawing at unseen barriers, voices pleading for release. The whispers coalesced into a single, thunderous command. Open me now." Lucas staggered backward, clutching his head as the vision overwhelmed him. Olivia collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "I can't," she choked out. "I can't stop it." The darkness expanded, consuming the warehouse, swallowing everything in its path. Somewhere in the distance, Benjamin's voice echoed faintly. "You shouldn't have come here." And then, silence. When Lucas opened his eyes, he was alone. The warehouse was gone, replaced by an endless void. Whispers surrounded him, louder than ever, pressing against his skull until he thought it might burst. He screamed, but no sound escaped. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him completely was the crate, floating impossibly in the emptiness, its lid inching open. Somewhere in Los Angeles, the sun rose again, frost melted from the trees, and life resumed its usual pace. But in apartment 3B, the curtains remained drawn and the whispers continued, waiting for their next listener. Don't just watch in the dark, click subscribe, like, and join now. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? The Book That Called Me. The streets of Chicago were slick with rain, reflecting the dim orange glow of streetlights like shattered mirrors. It was 5 in the morning, and the city seemed to hold its breath under a heavy sky streaked with gray clouds. The storm had rolled in from Lake Michigan without warning, drenching everything in sight. Victoria Evans stood on the corner of Wabash Avenue, clutching her coat tighter around herself as she waited for the traffic light to change. She hated mornings like this, cold, wet, and eerily quiet, but her job at the library demanded punctuality. Victoria worked at Harold Washington Library Center, a towering structure that loomed over South State Street like some ancient sentinel. The building's glass facade shimmered faintly in the pre-dawn gloom, catching the occasional flash of lightning that lit up the horizon. As she approached the entrance, her shoes squelching against the wet pavement, she noticed something odd, a single book lying face down on the steps leading up to the main doors. Its cover was dark, almost black, and water pooled around it in tiny rivulets. No one else was around. The security guard, who usually manned the early shift, hadn't arrived yet. She hesitated for a moment before picking it up. The book felt heavier than it should have been, its pages damp but not entirely soaked through. There was no title on the spine or cover, just an embossed pattern of swirling lines that seemed to shift slightly when viewed from different angles. A shiver ran down her spine, though she couldn't say why. Maybe it was the way the book felt. Alive somehow, pulsing faintly in her hands. Still, curiosity got the better of her. She tucked it under her arm and pushed open the heavy glass door. Inside, the library was silent except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Rows upon rows of shelves stretched out into shadowy corners, their contents neatly organized, yet somehow foreboding in the dim light. Victoria made her way to the circulation desk near the center of the atrium, setting the book down carefully, as if afraid it might bite. Her fingers lingered on the cover for a second longer than necessary before she pulled them away abruptly. Something about it unsettled her deeply, though she couldn't put her finger on what exactly it was. Her coworker, Daniel Harris, arrived shortly after, yawning loudly as he shuffled toward the desk. He was tall and lanky, with messy brown hair that stuck out in all directions despite his best efforts to tame it. "Morning, Vic," he muttered, glancing briefly at the book before shrugging. "What's this?" "I found it outside," Victoria replied, keeping her voice low so as not to disturb the stillness. "It doesn't have a title or anything." Daniel raised an eyebrow but didn't comment further. Instead, he reached out to touch the book, his hand hovering above it for a moment before making contact. His expression changed instantly from mild curiosity to outright alarm. "Whoa, this thing is freezing." Victoria nodded, though she hadn't thought much of the temperature earlier. Now that Daniel mentioned it, the air around the book did seem colder, almost unnaturally so. She watched as he flipped it open cautiously, revealing blank pages that looked yellowed with age despite being completely dry, or at least they appeared blank at first glance. When Daniel tilted the book slightly toward the light, faint words began to emerge, written in ink that shimmered like oil slicks. They weren't English or any language Victoria recognized, but the shapes twisted and writhed across the page as if trying to escape the confines of the paper. "This is messed up," Daniel whispered, snapping the book shut quickly. He glanced around nervously, as if expecting someone or something to appear from the shadows. "We should probably report this to management." But Victoria shook her head firmly. "Not yet. Let me look at it again." She wasn't sure why, but the book called to her in a way she couldn't explain. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was compulsion, a gnawing need to understand what lay within those shifting symbols. Reluctantly, Daniel handed it back to her, muttering something about coffee before disappearing into the staff lounge. Alone now, Victoria opened the book once more. This time, the sensation was stronger, the weight of unseen eyes watching her every move. The text seemed clearer too, forming jagged patterns that pulsed rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat. Without realizing it, she leaned closer, her nose nearly brushing the surface of the page. And then she heard it a whisper, soft and insidious, threading itself into her thoughts. It wasn't audible in the traditional sense, more like a memory surfacing unbidden. The voice spoke in fragments, disjointed phrases that coalesced into meaning only when she focused hard enough. "Find me," it said. "Free me." Startled, Victoria slammed the book shut, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. Had Daniel heard it? Was she imagining things? She glanced toward the staff lounge, half expecting him to come running out, but there was no sign of him, just silence and the oppressive weight of the library closing in around her. For the rest of the day, Victoria tried to focus on her duties, shelving returned books and assisting patrons with research queries. But the presence of the mysterious volume weighed heavily on her mind. It sat on the edge of her desk, seemingly innocuous yet impossible to ignore. Every time she passed by, she swore she could feel it humming softly, vibrating with suppressed energy. By late afternoon, the temptation became unbearable. She locked herself in the staff break room, determined to decipher even a fraction of what the book contained. The whispers returned almost immediately, louder this time, overlapping each other until they formed a cacophony of voices. Some pleaded for help, others screamed in agony, while a few laughed maniacally. Victoria pressed her palms against her ears, shaking her head violently to block them out. But the sound wasn't external, it came from inside her own skull, burrowing deeper with each passing second. Tears streamed down her face as she forced herself to concentrate, tracing the intricate patterns on the page with trembling fingers. Slowly, painstakingly, the symbols began to rearrange themselves, forming words she could finally understand. "They seek you," the text read. "They hunger." Before she could process what it meant, the lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness. A low rumble echoed through the building, like distant thunder, but somehow wrong, unnatural. Victoria scrambled to her feet, clutching the book tightly as she fumbled for the doorknob. When she stepped back into the main hall, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Shadows danced along the walls where none should exist, twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes. The air smelled metallic, tinged with decay. And worst of all, the silence was gone, replaced by faint scratching sounds, like claws dragging across wood. "Daniel?" she called out, her voice cracking with fear. No response. Panic rising, she moved toward the circulation desk, hoping to find some semblance of safety there. But as she rounded the corner, she froze. The shelves lining the aisles were no longer filled with books, they were empty. Hollow husks stretching endlessly into the gloom. Where had everything gone? What was happening? A sudden movement caught her eye, a figure darting between the rows ahead. It was small, hunched over, moving with jerky, unnatural motions. Victoria backed away instinctively, clutching the book to her chest like a shield. The figure stopped abruptly, turning to face her. Its head tilted sideways, impossibly far, joints cracking audibly. Then it lunged. She screamed, stumbling backward as the creature skittered forward on all fours, its limbs elongated and spider-like. Its face, if it could be called that, was featureless save for a gaping maw lined with needle-sharp teeth. The thing moved faster than she thought possible, closing the distance between them in seconds. Just as it leapt toward her, Victoria threw the book at it in desperation. The impact sent it sprawling, screeching in pain as smoke rose from where the tome had struck its body. Seizing the opportunity, she bolted toward the exit. Outside, the rain had intensified, soaking her instantly as she sprinted down the steps. Thunder boomed overhead, drowning out the sound of her frantic footsteps. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, slamming the door shut behind her and locking it with shaking hands. Breathing heavily, she glanced at the passenger seat and froze. The book sat there, dripping wet, its cover cracked open slightly to reveal glowing symbols etched onto the inner pages. "No," she whispered, reaching out tentatively. "How did you?" The car rocked violently as something slammed into the roof, denting the metal inward. Another crash followed, then another, accompanied by guttural growls that reverberated through the vehicle. Victoria ducked low, covering her head as shards of glass rained down from the shattered windshield. Through the chaos, she saw the library in the distance, its windows pulsing with sickly green light. The book vibrated fiercely in her lap, urging her to return. Against her better judgment, she obeyed. Back inside, the scene had changed again. The aisles were intact now, stocked with books as if nothing had happened, yet the oppressive feeling lingered, thicker than ever. The whispers grew louder, converging into a single voice that spoke directly to her. "You cannot run," it hissed. "You are mine now." Victoria spun around, searching for the source, but found only emptiness. Until she saw him, the man standing at the end of the aisle, partially obscured by shadows. He wore a tattered suit, his skin pale and translucent, eyes sunken and hollow. In his skeletal hands, he held a copy of the same book she carried. "Michael Parker," he rasped, taking a step closer. "I've been waiting." And then the world dissolved into darkness. When Victoria awoke, hours later, she was seated at the circulation desk. The library was empty, bathed in the golden light of dawn filtering through the windows. For a moment, she thought it had all been a nightmare. But when she looked down, the book lay open before her, its pages filled with fresh writing. "They will come for you next." The room behind the wall. Rain poured relentlessly over Anchorage as Daniel Harris drove through the deserted streets of the city just before dawn. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up with the deluge, while his headlights barely pierced the darkness, reflecting off the slick asphalt where puddles grew larger by the minute. He had moved to Alaska 3 months ago, seeking a fresh start after his divorce, finding solace in the isolation and cold weather that matched his mood. His new job at the local library kept him busy during the day, but the nights were long and lonely in his rented apartment on the outskirts of town. Daniel gripped the steering wheel tighter as he turned onto his street, noticing something unusual about his building. The third-floor window of his apartment was illuminated, though he distinctly remembered turning off all the lights before leaving for his early morning drive. A chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the Alaskan spring air seeping through the car's vents. He parked and sat for a moment, watching the rain streak down his windshield while debating whether to call the police or investigate himself. The rational part of his mind told him it was probably just a blown fuse or faulty wiring, but something about the yellow glow emanating from behind the curtains felt wrong. As he stepped out of the car, the cold rain immediately soaked through his jacket, and he could feel the water pooling in his shoes. The street was eerily silent except for the sound of rain hitting every available surface. No other cars passed by, no neighbors peeked out their windows. It was as if the entire neighborhood had been abandoned except for him and whatever waited inside his apartment. Reaching his door, he hesitated before inserting the key. The lock turned smoothly, too smoothly, as if someone had recently oiled it. Pushing the door open slowly, he called out, "Hello?" Though his voice barely rose above a whisper. The hallway light was on, which he definitely hadn't left that way. His heart pounded in his chest as he stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a soft click. The apartment seemed undisturbed at first glance. His coat still hung on the rack, his shoes remained neatly by the entrance, but something felt fundamentally different about the space. As he moved further into the living room, he noticed small details that sent warning signals through his mind. The books on his coffee table were slightly askew, not dramatically so, but enough to suggest they'd been handled recently. His laptop, which he always closed when leaving, was open and displaying the screensaver. More disturbingly, there was a faint smell in the air, something metallic and organic that made his stomach churn. It wasn't quite blood, but it carried the same primal warning that danger had been here, lingered, and might return at any moment. The bedroom door was ajar, and against his better judgment, Daniel pushed it open wider. Everything appeared normal until he noticed the closet door was slightly open, revealing a shadowy gap between the wall and the frame. He never left that door open, not since moving in. As he approached, he heard a soft creak from somewhere deep within the walls, like wood settling but with an unnatural rhythm. The sound repeated itself, growing louder and more insistent, then stopped abruptly. His breath caught in his throat as he realized the noise wasn't coming from the building's old structure, but rather from behind the wall itself. The next morning, Victoria Evans arrived at Daniel's apartment complex for their scheduled meeting. They had connected through a local support group for newcomers to Anchorage, bonding over their shared experiences of adjusting to life in Alaska. She stood outside his door, knocking repeatedly while checking her watch. The rain had lessened to a drizzle, but dark clouds still pressed heavily against the sky. When there was no answer after several minutes, she tried the door handle and found it unlocked. Inside, the apartment was deathly quiet, with an oppressive atmosphere that made her skin crawl despite the warmth of the heating system. Victoria called out Daniel's name as she entered, immediately noticing the same subtle signs of disturbance he had observed earlier. On the kitchen counter, she spotted his phone charger still plugged in, its cord coiled neatly, evidence that he hadn't planned to be gone long. In the living room, the books on the coffee table caught her attention. She recognized some of the titles. They were ones Daniel had mentioned reading recently, but now they seemed arranged in a pattern that suggested deliberate placement rather than casual browsing. Her unease grew as she noticed scuff marks on the carpet leading toward the bedroom. In the bedroom, Victoria's trained eye, honed from years working as a social worker, detected details others might miss. The closet door was indeed open, but what drew her attention was the baseboard along the far wall. There were fresh scratches marring the paint, and when she knelt to examine them closer, she discovered tiny fragments of plaster embedded in the carpet. Standing up, she pressed her palm against the wall and felt it give slightly, accompanied by a soft crunching sound. Her heart raced as she realized this section of the wall was thinner than it should be, as if something lay hidden behind it. Michael Parker, the building's maintenance supervisor, arrived shortly after Victoria's call. A grizzled man in his late 50s with decades of experience in construction and property management, he listened intently as she explained her findings. His expression grew increasingly grave as he examined the wall, running his fingers along the edges of the baseboard. Without saying a word, he fetched tools from his maintenance cart and began carefully removing sections of the wall paneling. The drywall came away easily, almost too easily, revealing a narrow cavity behind. What they discovered in the hidden space defied immediate comprehension. Packed tightly within the cavity were dozens of small objects wrapped in yellowed newspaper, each bundle tied with twine. The air that escaped as Michael opened the first package carried the same metallic smell Victoria had detected earlier. Inside was a collection of personal items, a child's necklace, a set of house keys, a driver's license belonging to someone named Sarah Mitchell. Each successive package contained similar artifacts, all meticulously preserved, but clearly taken from different individuals over many years. The realization hit them simultaneously. They had uncovered evidence of something far more sinister than either had imagined possible. The discovery triggered a chain reaction of events that consumed the lives of everyone involved. Local authorities descended upon the building, forcing residents to evacuate while forensic teams worked around the clock. Victoria found herself unable to leave, drawn back daily to witness the investigation unfold. She learned that the building had been constructed in the 1920s and had changed hands numerous times throughout its history. Previous tenants had reported strange occurrences, sounds behind walls, unexplained shadows, sudden temperature drops, but these complaints had always been dismissed as typical of older buildings. What no one had suspected was that someone had been using the building's hidden spaces as a repository for stolen memories. As detectives cataloged the items, patterns emerged that chilled even the most seasoned investigators. Many of the victims had disappeared without a trace, their cases eventually classified as cold files. Some had vanished decades ago, while others were more recent. The oldest item dated back to 1947, a silver locket containing a photograph of two young girls, while the newest was a smartphone manufactured only 3 years prior. The collection spanned generations, suggesting that whoever had been operating behind these walls had maintained their activities for nearly 75 years. The implications were staggering and raised questions about how such systematic predation could have gone unnoticed for so long. Daniel's disappearance added another layer of complexity to the case. Security footage from the building's lobby showed him returning home the previous night, but never leaving again. His car remained parked outside, and his personal belongings were still in the apartment. The only clue was a set of muddy footprints leading from his bedroom to the hidden cavity in the wall, prints that matched his shoe size exactly. Investigators theorized that he might have stumbled upon the collector in the act and become another victim, but without physical evidence, they couldn't confirm this theory. Victoria became obsessed with understanding the pattern behind the disappearances. She spent hours poring over police reports, cross-referencing dates and locations with historical weather data. A disturbing trend emerged. Nearly all the abductions had occurred during heavy rainstorms, particularly in spring when the days were shortest and visibility poorest. The timing suggested premeditation and intimate knowledge of both the building's layout and the routines of its occupants. Whoever had been collecting these artifacts understood human behavior well enough to predict when people would be most vulnerable. The building itself seemed to become more active as the investigation progressed. Residents who had lived there for years reported hearing strange noises at night, thumps and scrapes that echoed through the walls. The heating system developed inexplicable malfunctions, causing rooms to alternate between freezing and sweltering temperatures. Maintenance workers refused to enter certain areas alone, claiming they felt watched even when no one else was present. Most disturbingly, several people reported seeing fleeting shadows move across walls where no source of light could account for them. Forensic examination of the hidden cavity revealed additional horrors. Deep gouges marred the wooden framework, and analysis showed traces of human tissue embedded in the splinters. Blood spatter patterns suggested violent struggles had taken place within the confined space, though the lack of bodies complicated efforts to reconstruct specific events. The collector had apparently used the cavity as both storage and execution chamber, creating a macabre shrine to their crimes. Experts noted that the care taken in preserving each artifact spoke to a deep psychological pathology, possibly rooted in trauma or obsession. Detectives identified a potential suspect through painstaking research into the building's ownership history. A man named Edgar Thompson had purchased the property in 1946 and managed it until his death in 1982. Records showed he had lived in the very apartment where Daniel had resided, and multiple former tenants recalled rumors about strange noises emanating from his unit. However, Thompson's involvement raised more questions than answers, given that items continued to appear in the cavity long after his passing. This suggested either complicity from subsequent owners or that someone else had taken up his dark legacy. Victoria's investigation took a personal turn when she discovered her own grandmother's name among the list of missing persons. Margaret Evans had vanished in 1963 while visiting Anchorage, leaving behind only a hotel receipt and unanswered questions. The revelation shook Victoria to her core, transforming her professional interest into something far more visceral. She found herself spending nights in the vacant building, sitting in the empty apartment, and listening to the walls breathe with secrets that refused to remain buried. Spring gave way to summer, but the rain continued to fall in Anchorage, as if nature itself mourned the atrocities uncovered in the old building. The investigation expanded beyond municipal boundaries as connections emerged between missing persons cases across Alaska. Detectives identified a network of similar hidden spaces in other buildings throughout the state, each containing its own collection of stolen lives. The scale of the operation suggested coordination among multiple individuals, raising the possibility that what had begun as one man's obsession had evolved into something far more organized and dangerous. One night, while Victoria sat alone in the apartment, she heard a sound that froze her blood. From behind the newly repaired wall came the unmistakable creak of footsteps, slow and deliberate. She grabbed her phone to call for help, but found no signal in the suddenly dead zone of the building. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the soft rustle of fabric brushing against wood. Then came a voice, barely audible but unmistakably human, whispering words that made her skin crawl. "You shouldn't have looked. You shouldn't have seen." The voice sounded ancient, yet familiar, carrying echoes of countless voices absorbed over decades. The police response team arrived 20 minutes later, bursting into the apartment with weapons drawn. They found Victoria unconscious on the floor, her phone shattered beside her. Paramedics determined she had suffered a severe panic attack but would recover. Yet when they examined the wall where she claimed to have heard the voice, they discovered something that defied explanation. Fresh scratches marred the newly installed drywall, forming words that spelled out a single chilling message: "Not done yet." The marks were too high for anyone to reach without assistance, and security cameras showed no one entering or leaving the apartment during the crucial time period. As weeks turned into months, the case remained unsolved despite mounting evidence. The building was eventually condemned, deemed structurally unsafe due to unforeseen damage discovered during renovations. Residents scattered to different parts of the city, but many reported feeling eyes upon them in their new homes, especially during rainstorms. Victoria returned to her work as a social worker, but found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, certain that whatever had operated in those walls continued to watch from the shadows. The last anyone saw of Daniel Harris was captured by a traffic camera 2 blocks from his apartment on the night he disappeared. The footage showed him walking briskly through the rain, occasionally glancing over his shoulder as if pursued. His image blurred momentarily, then reappeared moving in the opposite direction, though no one else appeared in frame. When enhanced, the video revealed something impossible. His reflection in a storefront window showed him reaching toward the camera with an expression of pure terror, though his physical form continued walking away. The file remains archived, awaiting technological advances that might explain the anomaly. Today, the building stands empty on the outskirts of Anchorage, its windows boarded up and its doors sealed with official notices. During heavy rains, passers-by claim to hear faint whispers emanating from within, voices overlapping in desperate pleas for help. Local authorities maintain regular patrols of the area, though officers assigned to these duties often request transfers after short periods. The case files remain open, gathering dust in secure archives while waiting for new leads that may never come. And somewhere, in the spaces between walls and beneath floorboards, the collection continues to grow. Don't just watch in the dark, click subscribe, like, and join now. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? The customer who never left the store. The cicadas were louder than usual that summer night in Charleston, their rhythmic buzzing weaving through the thick humidity that clung to every surface. Lucas Allen stood behind the counter of his small convenience store on King Street, absently wiping down the already spotless glass display case. The neon open sign flickered slightly in the window, casting an uneven glow across the rows of snacks and beverages lining the aisles. It was nearly midnight, and the usual Friday crowd had already come and gone, leaving only the persistent hum of the refrigerators and the distant sound of traffic from the historic district. Lucas checked his phone for what felt like the 100th time that evening. No new messages, just another quiet night in a city that never truly slept. He sighed and glanced at the security camera monitors mounted above the cigarette rack. Each screen showed a different angle of the store's interior, all empty except for his own reflection in the convex lenses. Something about tonight felt different though, like the air itself was heavier than normal. His eyes lingered on the darkest corners of the footage before moving back to the register. The bell above the door jingled softly, making Lucas look up with automatic politeness. A woman stepped inside, her presence immediately altering the atmosphere of the shop. She wore a long coat that seemed inappropriate for the sweltering July heat, its dark fabric hanging loosely around her thin frame. Her face was partially obscured by stringy blonde hair that caught the fluorescent light in strange ways, as if it didn't quite belong there. Lucas noticed how her shoes made no sound against the tiled floor. "Can I help you find something?" he asked, his voice carrying just a touch of professional warmth. The woman didn't respond right away. Instead, she moved slowly toward the back of the store, her head tilted at an unnatural angle as she examined the shelves. Lucas watched her reflection in the glass refrigerator doors. Something about her movements seemed off, almost mechanical. Charlotte Robinson pushed her cart down aisle 3, debating between chips and pretzels. She paused when she realized the woman in the dark coat hadn't moved from where she'd been standing for the past 10 minutes. The stranger was now facing the wall, one hand resting on the metal shelving unit. Charlotte cleared her throat softly as she passed, but the woman didn't acknowledge her presence. There was something unsettling about the way her fingers curled around the edge of the shelf, knuckles white against the dull metal. Lucas finished counting the drawer for the third time, the numbers blurring together in his mind. The woman still hadn't approached the register. He could see her in his peripheral vision, standing in the same spot near the snack aisle. Occasionally, he'd hear the soft rustle of her coat, though he couldn't be sure if she was actually moving anything from the shelves. The store's lights seemed dimmer than usual, casting long shadows across the floor. When he looked directly at her, she appeared perfectly normal, just another customer browsing late at night. But whenever his attention shifted elsewhere, he could feel her watching him. Amelia Mitchell entered the store 20 minutes later, her nurse's scrubs still damp from walking through the humid night air. She needed headache medicine after her double shift at Roper Street Francis Hospital. The first thing she noticed was the temperature. It felt several degrees colder inside than it should have been. Then she saw the woman in the dark coat standing near the beverage coolers. Something about her posture seemed wrong, like she was leaning into the glass without actually touching it. Amelia grabbed her medicine quickly, avoiding eye contact as she approached the register. The transaction took longer than necessary. Lucas kept glancing at the security monitors, noting how the woman's position never changed despite the passage of time. On the cameras, she appeared as a dark smudge against the bright colors of the snack aisle, her features indistinct even in high definition. When he finally looked up from the register, Amelia was already gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of hospital-grade soap. The cicadas outside seemed louder now, their song almost frantic against the glass windows. Charlotte decided she needed to leave. The woman had started humming softly, a tune that sent shivers down her spine, though she couldn't place why. As she approached the register, she noticed something peculiar. The floor tiles beneath the woman's feet looked newer than the rest, as if they'd been recently replaced. The grout lines were cleaner, the pattern slightly misaligned with the surrounding area. Lucas rang up her purchase without speaking, his hands trembling slightly as he handled the cash. Neither of them acknowledged the figure still standing silently among the snacks. The clock ticked past midnight. Lucas began his closing routine, straightening displays and checking expiration dates. The woman remained in her spot, seemingly unaware of the store's operating hours. When he finally mustered the courage to approach her, she turned toward him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'll be leaving soon," she said, her voice carrying an odd echo despite the carpeted floor. Lucas nodded and returned to the register, though his heart pounded in his chest. Something about her statement felt more like a warning than an assurance. Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that she'd seen the woman before. During her walk home, fragments of memory surfaced. A patient years ago who had died in room 312, her body found cold and alone after the night staff failed to check on her. The details matched too perfectly. The dark coat, the stringy blonde hair, the way she stood so still, it was easy to forget she was there. Amelia quickened her pace, the streetlights casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward her from every direction. Back at the store, Lucas prepared to lock up. The woman was still there, now examining the lottery tickets with unnatural focus. Her reflection in the glass case showed details that shouldn't have been possible, her eyes too large, her mouth moving, though no sound emerged. When Lucas announced the store was closing, she simply nodded and walked toward the back exit. The security cameras captured her movements perfectly until she reached the threshold, then suddenly she vanished from all screens simultaneously. Charlotte lay awake in her apartment on Queen Street, unable to stop thinking about the encounter. The humming had lodged itself in her mind, repeating endlessly like a broken record. She pulled out her phone and searched recent news articles, finding nothing unusual about the convenience store or its employees. Yet when she scrolled through the business's social media page, she noticed something strange. In every photo taken inside the shop, the same dark figure appeared in the background, always partially obscured, but unmistakably present. Lucas locked the front door and set the alarm, his hands shaking as he worked. The back exit showed no signs of forced entry or recent use. The woman's absence felt heavier than her presence had been. As he walked to his car, he couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. The parking lot lights buzzed faintly overhead, attracting clouds of insects that cast dancing shadows across the asphalt. When he glanced back at the store windows, he saw her standing exactly where he'd left her, staring out with an expression he couldn't read. Amelia called in sick the next day, unable to face the memories flooding back with each passing hour. She researched the store's history, discovering it had been built on the site of an old boarding house that burned down decades ago. Records mentioned a woman who had disappeared during the fire, her body never found among the charred remains. The description matched the figure from the store perfectly, right down to the humming that witnesses claimed they could still hear on quiet nights. The following evening, Lucas arrived for his shift to find everything exactly as he'd left it. The security footage showed 14 hours of empty aisles and silent registers. Yet, when he reviewed the previous night's recording, there she was again, appearing in the snack aisle as if she'd never left, moving with purpose toward the back of the store. The timestamp confirmed she'd been there the entire time, invisible to everyone except through the unblinking eyes of the cameras. Charlotte couldn't stay away. Something compelled her to return to the store, to confront the mystery that had taken root in her thoughts. When she entered that night, the air felt colder than before, and the humming was louder, vibrating through her bones like a tuning fork. The woman stood in the same spot, surrounded by products that seemed to decay faster than they should. Their expiration dates read months in the future, yet their packaging was faded and brittle, as if time itself bent around her presence. Lucas began documenting everything. He kept detailed notes about each encounter, noting patterns in her behavior and appearance. The woman never spoke unless directly addressed, and even then, her responses were cryptic and often nonsensical. Yet, she seemed to know intimate details about each person who interacted with her, childhood memories Charlotte had forgotten, medical cases Amelia thought she'd kept confidential, personal struggles Lucas had never shared with anyone. The knowledge hung in the air like a threat, preventing them from seeking help. The city continued its usual rhythm around them, oblivious to the supernatural phenomenon unfolding on King Street. Tourists snapped photos of the historic district, capturing streaks of darkness in their pictures that they dismissed as lens flares. Locals complained about power fluctuations in the area, their clocks running minutes fast or slow without explanation. The cicadas grew louder with each passing night, their song taking on an almost musical quality that matched the woman's haunting melody. Amelia discovered other victims during her research, people who had encountered similar figures in different locations throughout Charleston's history. Each story followed the same pattern. A mysterious woman appearing in places of commerce, lingering beyond reason, collecting pieces of people's lives until they became trapped in her orbit. Some claimed she was searching for something specific, others believed she fed on human connection. All agreed that once she marked you, there was no escaping her influence. Lucas found himself changing. His reflection in the store windows seemed less substantial, his features fading slightly each day. Customers commented on how tired he looked, though he slept better than he had in years. The security cameras captured moments when he wasn't entirely present, his form flickering like static between frames. The woman watched these transformations with apparent satisfaction, her humming growing more complex, as if composing a symphony only she could hear. Charlotte's friends noticed her withdrawal from social activities. She spent hours sitting in her apartment, staring at the convenience store's security feed she'd hacked into. The woman's movements created patterns that resembled ancient symbols when traced over time. Mathematical equations formed in the spaces between appearances, suggesting a logic behind the madness. Yet each revelation came at a cost, fragments of Charlotte's personality chipped away, replaced by an understanding she couldn't articulate. The temperature in the store dropped steadily, creating condensation on the windows that spelled out words when viewed from certain angles. "Help me" appeared repeatedly, though none of them could determine if it was a plea or a command. The refrigeration units malfunctioned constantly, their contents freezing solid regardless of settings. Products aged rapidly on the shelves, some turning to dust within hours of stocking. Time itself seemed to warp around the woman, bending reality to accommodate her presence. Amelia's dreams became vivid and disturbing. She found herself wandering through endless aisles of forgotten stores, each one containing the same dark figure waiting patiently. The humming followed her into consciousness, becoming a constant companion that drowned out other sounds. Her colleagues at the hospital remarked on her improved intuition regarding patient care, though they couldn't explain how she knew things she shouldn't. The line between her world and the woman's realm blurred until she couldn't tell which side she belonged to. Lucas attempted to break the cycle by staying away from the store. For 3 days, he avoided King Street entirely, hoping distance would sever the connection. Instead, the woman's influence grew stronger. She appeared in his apartment mirror, reflected in puddles during rainstorms, visible in the steam rising from his morning coffee. The humming never ceased, matching his heartbeat until he couldn't distinguish between internal and external sounds. His attempts to warn others fell on deaf ears, their faces blank as if seeing through him. Charlotte documented everything obsessively, filling notebooks with observations and calculations. The patterns revealed themselves gradually, forming a complex web of connections between victims across generations. Each person had experienced loss or isolation significant enough to create a void the woman could fill. They had sought comfort in material possessions, believing wealth or convenience could replace human connection. The realization hit her like a physical blow. They were all customers who had never truly left the store, trapped by their own desires. The final confrontation occurred on the hottest night of the summer. The cicadas screamed in harmony with the humming, their combined song shaking the glass in the store's windows. Lucas, Charlotte, and Amelia found themselves drawn back to the convenience store despite their efforts to resist. The woman waited for them in aisle 3, her dark coat billowing as if caught in a wind that didn't exist. Her smile revealed too many teeth, each one gleaming like polished stone. "You've learned," she said, her voice resonating through the empty store. But learning isn't enough. The floor tiles beneath them shifted, revealing the foundation of the old boarding house. Charred wood and ash filled the space where modern construction should have been. The security cameras captured everything perfectly, broadcasting their final moments to empty monitors throughout the building. One by one, they stepped forward, unable to resist the pull any longer. The store remained open for business the next day. New employees arrived, unaware of the previous staff. Customers browsed the aisles, selecting items they didn't need but couldn't refuse. In the security footage, dark figures moved among the shelves, their forms becoming clearer with each passing night. The humming continued, growing louder with each new victim drawn into its melody. And in aisle 3, the woman waited patiently, collecting souls who had forgotten what it meant to truly leave. The room that breathed. Boston stirred under the weight of another spring morning, the air thick with a peculiar warmth that seemed misplaced for the season. Daniel Harris stood on the cracked sidewalk outside number 17 Marlborough Street, his fingers tracing the edge of an old brass key in his pocket. The building before him loomed like a forgotten sentinel, its red brick facade darkened by decades of Boston winters and neglect. Across the street, Victoria Evans leaned against her parked car, arms crossed tightly across her chest as she watched Daniel approach the entrance. The neighborhood was waking up slowly, curtains twitching in nearby windows as residents observed the newcomers. Michael Parker emerged from the alley beside the building, his camera slung around his neck, capturing the uneven angles of the structure with professional precision. "This place gives me the creeps," he muttered, though his lens stayed trained on the upper floors, where shadows seemed to move independently of the rising sunday. Daniel's footsteps echoed hollowly as he climbed the worn stone steps to the front door. The wood beneath his feet felt spongy, yielding slightly with each step. He paused at the threshold, glancing back at his companions. Victoria gave him a tight smile while Michael adjusted his camera settings, seemingly oblivious to the faint scraping sound coming from somewhere deep within the building. The key turned with unexpected ease, revealing a vestibule that smelled of damp paper and something else. Something metallic and sharp. Inside, the air was unnaturally still, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Dust motes hung suspended in shafts of weak morning light that filtered through grimy windows. To their left, a staircase spiraled upward into darkness, its banister wrapped in layers of peeling paint. Directly ahead, a hallway stretched toward the rear of the building, lined with doors that seemed to lean inward as if drawn by some invisible force. The wallpaper, once elegant, now peeled away in long strips that curled toward the floor like dead leaves. Victoria's heels clicked against the hardwood as she moved to examine a series of framed photographs hanging crookedly on the wall. Her fingers hovered above the glass but didn't touch. "These pictures," she began, her voice dropping to a whisper. In each frame, people stood stiffly posed, their eyes fixed on something just beyond the camera's view. What disturbed them most was the background. Through windows behind the subjects, they could see the same room appearing in every photograph, its details shifting subtly but unmistakably present in each era depicted. Michael joined her, his camera clicking softly as he documented the unsettling gallery. "That's impossible," he said, pointing to one particular image. "Look at the dress styles. These photos span nearly a century, but that room." His voice trailed off as he noticed something moving in the corner of the frame. When he looked up, the hallway appeared empty, yet the sensation of being watched pressed heavily against his skin. The temperature dropped suddenly, causing their breath to mist in the air. From somewhere above came the distinct sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth across the ceiling. Daniel called out, his voice echoing unnaturally loud in the confined space. The footsteps stopped immediately, followed by complete silence that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. Then came a new sound, a soft, rhythmic creaking like the gentle expansion and contraction of old wood. But this wasn't coming from the structure itself. It was emanating from the room at the end of the hall, pulsing with a life of its own. Daniel took the first step toward the source of the sound, his palm slick against the railing of the staircase. The wooden steps groaned beneath his weight, each complaint sounding louder than the last. Halfway up, he paused, certain he'd heard whispered words trailing after him like cobwebs brushing against his ears. Victoria followed close behind, her hand occasionally reaching out to steady herself against the wall, only to pull back sharply each time her fingers made contact. The wallpaper felt warm to the touch, almost feverish, and when she looked closely, she thought she saw veins of black mold spreading outward from each point of contact. At the top landing, they found themselves facing 3 doors, each painted a different shade of gray that seemed to shift depending on how long you stared. The middle door stood slightly ajar, swaying gently, despite the absence of any breeze. Through the gap, they could see movement, not human movement, but something more akin to shadows stretching and retreating across the far wall. Michael raised his camera, framing the scene through the viewfinder, but what he saw through the lens made his hands tremble. The room appeared larger through the camera, its dimensions distorted in ways that defied logic. "Did you hear that?" Victoria's voice cracked as she spoke. They all froze, listening to the sound of breathing, deep, measured inhalations that filled the corridor like waves crashing against a distant shore. The sound wasn't coming from them. It was too synchronized, too deliberate. Daniel reached for the doorknob, his fingers brushing against metal that felt impossibly cold. As his hand closed around it, the breathing hitched, then resumed with greater intensity. The door opened with a reluctant creak, revealing a space that seemed to swallow the available light rather than reflect it. Inside, the air was dense and humid, carrying the scent of earth after rain mixed with something sour and metallic. The walls were covered in what appeared to be ancient wallpaper, but upon closer inspection, they realized it was actually layers of dried, yellowed paper stacked directly onto the plaster. Pages upon pages of handwritten text, fragments of letters and drawings pressed together like geological strata. Some sections seemed to ripple when touched, as if the surface retained some vestige of life. In the center of the room stood an antique writing desk, its surface stained with ink blots that had long since dried black. Victoria approached the desk cautiously, her attention drawn to a leather-bound journal resting open at its center. The handwriting inside was spidery and erratic, the ink varying in color from fresh black to faded brown. As she read the first few lines, her reflection in the window behind the desk caught her eye. She froze, watching as her mirrored self continued reading even after she had lowered the book. The reflection smiled at her, then mouthed words that didn't match her own movements. When she turned to look back at the actual room, she found Daniel staring at her with wide eyes, his lips moving soundlessly. Michael remained in the doorway, his camera trained on the scene unfolding before him. Through the viewfinder, he watched as the room's dimensions shifted imperceptibly, walls bowing inward, then snapping back like living tissue. The floorboards beneath his feet pulsed gently, maintaining the same rhythm as the breathing they had heard earlier. He noticed something new. Symbols carved into the baseboards, their shapes disturbingly familiar. They matched the patterns he had seen in the photographs downstairs, though here they seemed more pronounced, almost angry in their execution. The room grew darker despite the approaching noonday sunday. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, pooling in corners and creating shapes that suggested movement just beyond perception. A soft scratching sound began behind the walls, like fingernails dragged lightly across wood. It started in one corner, then traveled methodically around the perimeter of the room, gaining speed and intensity with each circuit. The breathing deepened, becoming labored, until it sounded like someone struggling for air. Yet no living person occupied the space with them. Daniel moved toward the far wall, drawn by an inexplicable force. His fingers brushed against the paper-covered surface, feeling the individual sheets shift under his touch. Some pages crumbled to dust at his slightest contact, while others felt slick and wet, leaving dark stains on his fingertips. He realized with growing dread that the papers weren't merely covering the wall, they were growing from it, sprouting like fungal growths in the dim light. Words formed and reformed before his eyes, sentences rearranging themselves into coherent paragraphs that told stories of lives lived and lost within these walls. The breathing changed pitch suddenly, becoming higher and more rapid. The room responded physically, its walls expanding outward, then contracting violently. Books fell from shelves that hadn't been there moments before, their pages fluttering like wounded birds. The desk in the center split down the middle, revealing a cavity stuffed with more paper, all bearing the same frantic handwriting. Victoria stumbled backward as the journal in her hands began to burn, not with fire, but with a cold light that seared her palms without leaving marks. The reflected version of herself in the window had disappeared completely, replaced by something darker and less defined. Michael's camera flashed repeatedly, capturing images he couldn't see with his naked eye. Through the viewfinder, he watched shadowy figures emerge from the walls, their forms distorted but somehow familiar. They moved with purpose, gathering around the edges of the room like spectators at a performance. Their faces remained indistinct, but their presence pressed against his consciousness like a migraine building behind his eyes. The symbols on the baseboards glowed faintly, their light pulsing in time with the room's breathing. A sudden gust of wind swept through the space, though none of the windows had opened. Papers swirled in miniature cyclones, settling randomly across the floor in patterns that suggested meaning. The breathing grew ragged, punctuated by wet, gurgling sounds that made Victoria cover her ears with both hands. She sank to her knees as memories flooded her mind, memories that weren't hers. Faces of strangers flashed before her eyes, each accompanied by a surge of emotion so intense it brought tears streaming down her face. Pain, loss, despair, each sensation more vivid than anything she had experienced in her own life. Daniel found himself drawn to the farthest corner of the room, where the wall seemed to pulse more noticeably than the others. His hands moved of their own accord, tearing at the layers of paper until he exposed bare wood underneath. Carved deeply into the surface were names, hundreds of them, overlapping and intertwining like roots. Some he recognized from the photographs downstairs, others were unfamiliar but carried the same weight of tragedy. As he traced his fingers over the names, he felt them respond, the wood warming beneath his touch and the letters seeming to rearrange themselves into new configurations. The room's breathing became erratic, gasping now as if fighting for survival. The walls contracted violently, forcing everyone toward the center. Papers flapped like trapped birds, their whispers building into a cacophony of voices speaking in languages none of them understood. The symbols on the baseboards burned brighter, their light casting everything in harsh relief. Michael's camera died suddenly, its battery drained despite being fully charged that morning. Still, he kept pressing the shutter button, hoping to capture something of what he saw through the viewfinder, shapes moving just beyond the threshold of visibility. Victoria screamed as the floor beneath her feet gave way, not collapsing, but opening like a mouth hungry for sustenance. She fell forward, catching herself on hands that sank partially into the wood as if it had become liquid. The journal's cold light spread across her arms, illuminating veins that seemed to contain flowing ink rather than blood. Memories continued to assault her mind, each one bringing physical pain that made her whole body convulse. The reflected version of herself returned in the window, reaching out toward her with hands that passed through the glass as if it were water. Daniel tore at the wall faster now, his fingers bleeding as he clawed deeper into the wood. With each name he uncovered, the room reacted more violently. The breathing became wheezing, punctuated by wet coughs that sprayed droplets of something dark against the remaining intact wall. The uncovered names began to glow, their light joining with that of the symbols on the baseboards until the entire room shimmered with an otherworldly radiance. Shapes moved within the walls themselves, pressing against the surface from the other side like creatures trying to break free. Michael retreated to the doorway, his legs shaking as he watched his friends struggle against forces they couldn't comprehend. Through his useless camera, he saw the truth of the room laid bare. A massive, beating heart at its core, pumping darkness instead of blood through veins of corrupted wood. The symbols served as valves, regulating the flow of whatever malignant force inhabited the space. The photographs downstairs weren't just documentation, they were warnings, each one showing the room consuming another victim who had come too close to understanding its nature. The breathing stopped suddenly, leaving a silence so profound it hurt their ears. The room held its collective breath, waiting. The walls began closing in, not quickly, but inevitably, their movement accompanied by the sound of thousands of pages turning simultaneously. Victoria pulled herself free from the floor, her arms streaked with black ichor that evaporated into smoke before hitting the ground. The journal's light had consumed her shadow, leaving her outlined in negative space. She joined Daniel at the wall, helping him tear away the remaining paper in a desperate attempt to reach whatever core lay hidden beneath. As they worked, the room showed them its true face. The walls weren't solid, they were composed of compressed memories, each layer containing the essence of someone who had tried to understand or escape. Faces pressed against the surface from the other side, their mouths open in silent screams that vibrated through the very bones of the building. The symbols on the baseboards merged into a single pulsing sigil that dominated the floor, its light so bright it burned away the darkness entirely. The heart at the room's center beat once, twice, then exploded outward in a wave of energy that threw them all backward. When they opened their eyes again, they found themselves standing outside number 17 Marlborough Street. The building looked different now, newer somehow, its bricks clean and its windows reflecting the afternoon sun without distortion. A young couple walked past them, discussing plans to renovate the upstairs apartment. Daniel reached into his pocket for the brass key, but found only lint. Michael's camera hung heavy around his neck, its memory card wiped clean. Victoria's hands bore no marks, though she could still feel the phantom burn of ink-filled veins beneath her skin. They never spoke about what happened inside the room. Each carried their own piece of its secret, buried deep where it couldn't consume them completely. Sometimes, late at night, Daniel would wake to the sound of breathing coming from his closet. Michael developed a habit of taking long detours to avoid walking past 17 Marlborough Street. Victoria found herself drawn to old journals and letters, unable to resist the urge to document everything she encountered. The room had marked them, claimed part of their essence, and though they had escaped its physical confines, its influence followed them like a shadow that refused to dissipate. Weeks later, during another unseasonably warm spring morning, a new set of tenants moved into the building. They marveled at how well-preserved the old place was, how the upstairs apartment seemed to breathe with a life of its own. In the main bedroom, they discovered an antique writing desk with a leather-bound journal resting open at its center. The first tenant to touch it felt a surge of inspiration so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. She began writing immediately, her pen moving across the page with a will that wasn't entirely her own. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of pages turning and the gentle, measured breathing of something that had waited patiently for new voices to add to its collection. Don't just watch in the dark. Click subscribe, like, and join now. Before we begin, tell me where are you listening from and what time is it there? The whisper that breathed. A summer storm brewed over Boston, its dark clouds casting long shadows across the narrow streets of Beacon Hill. The air was thick with humidity, and the faint scent of rain mingled with the salty breeze from the nearby harbor. At precisely 5 in the afternoon, when the sun should have still been high, an unnatural twilight descended upon the city. Andrew Scott hurried down Pinckney Street, his leather satchel slapping against his side with each quickened step. The first rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, vibrating through the cobblestones beneath his worn loafers. He had taken this route home 1,000 times before, but today something felt different. The usual sounds of the neighborhood, children playing, dogs barking, the occasional car engine were strangely muted. Only the wind seemed alive, whispering through the ancient trees that lined the street, whispering in a way that made Andrew's skin prickle. He glanced at the old Victorian house at number 17, its windows dark and unwelcoming despite the early hour. The for sale sign in the yard swayed gently, though he couldn't feel any breeze on his face. Madison Rivera stood at her kitchen window on Mount Vernon Street, staring out at the gathering storm. Her teacup trembled slightly in her hand as she watched the clouds churn above the gold dome of the State House. She had lived in this neighborhood her entire life, but never had she seen such an ominous sky this early in the evening. The antique clock on her wall ticked loudly in the silence, each second stretching longer than it should. Something about the atmosphere felt wrong, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. In the South End, James Cooper sat alone in his apartment on Tremont Street, absently flipping through old photographs. The lightning flashed outside, illuminating his collection of vintage cameras displayed on the shelves. His fingers paused on a particular picture, a group of friends gathered at Boston Common, smiling faces frozen in time. But as another bolt of lightning illuminated the room, he could have sworn one of the faces in the photograph moved, just for a moment. Just enough to make his heart skip a beat. The frame fell from his hands, shattering on the hardwood floor. Andrew found himself drawn to the old cemetery at the top of Copp's Hill. The wrought iron gates creaked open before him, though he was certain he hadn't touched them. The gravestones stood like silent sentinels, their weathered inscriptions barely visible in the dim light. As he walked between the rows, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't words exactly, more like fragments of memories or thoughts that didn't belong to him. A cold droplet of rain hit his cheek, followed by another. The storm was getting closer, the thunder growing more insistent, yet he couldn't bring himself to leave. Madison's phone rang suddenly, making her jump. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but something compelled her to answer. "Hello?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. There was no response, only the sound of breathing, slow, deliberate, measured breaths that seemed to echo in her ear. The connection remained open, the breathing continuing without variation. She wanted to hang up, but her fingers wouldn't move. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending a chill through the room despite the summer heat. James had gathered the broken pieces of the photograph frame and was attempting to reconstruct it when he noticed something odd. The image inside had changed. Where once there had been 6 smiling faces, now there were 7. The new face wasn't clear, just a blur of features that seemed to shift when he tried to focus on them. The room temperature dropped suddenly, and his breath came out in visible puffs. From somewhere deep within the walls, he heard a soft scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across wood, getting closer with each passing moment. The rain began to fall in earnest now, drumming against rooftops and streaming down window panes throughout the city. Andrew found himself standing before a particular gravestone, its inscription worn almost smooth by time. Yet he could read it perfectly in his mind. Elizabeth Hargrove, 1865. The name triggered something in his memory, though he couldn't place why. The whispers around him formed words now, disjointed phrases that painted pictures of a life cut tragically short. Never meant to. Kept calling me back. So cold here. Madison finally managed to end the call, dropping the phone on the counter with shaking hands. The lights flickered, then steadied, then flickered again. She moved to check the circuit breaker, but stopped when she saw her reflection in the hallway mirror. It wasn't quite right, her eyes were wrong, too dark, too empty. She blinked, and the reflection smiled while she remained expressionless. The breathing from the phone call continued behind her, though no device was near. "You shouldn't have answered," it seemed to say, so softly she might have imagined it. James had barricaded himself in his bedroom, the photograph hidden safely in a drawer. The scraping had stopped, replaced by a gentle tapping at his window. When he looked, there was nothing there except the distorted reflection of his room. But something about the angles was off, as if space itself had bent slightly out of shape. His cameras, usually arranged with precise care, were now facing inward, their lenses trained on his bed. "They see you," he whispered to himself, though he wasn't sure where the words came from. The storm outside reached its peak, lightning flashing continuously, yet the darkness in his room deepened rather than lifted. The 3 of them, Andrew, Madison, James, were connected by threads they couldn't see, drawn together by forces beyond their understanding. Each had experienced strange occurrences before, dismissing them as coincidence or imagination. But now, as the storm battered Boston and the boundaries between worlds grew thin, they would be forced to confront the truth. Elizabeth Hargrove's story wasn't finished, and somehow they had become part of its conclusion. Andrew traced his fingers along the edge of the gravestone, feeling the rough stone bite into his skin. The pain was real, grounding him when everything else felt surreal. The whispers told him things, terrible things, about what had happened here all those years ago. A forbidden love, a desperate plea, a final betrayal. The rain soaked through his clothes, but he barely noticed. In his mind's eye, he could see her, Elizabeth, young and beautiful, standing at the edge of the hill, looking out toward the harbor. Her lips moved, forming words he couldn't hear over the storm. But he could feel them, resonating in his chest like a second heartbeat. Madison had retreated to her basement, seeking sanctuary from whatever haunted her home. The old furnace hummed in the corner, its rhythm matching the breathing that now filled every room. Boxes stacked against the walls contained fragments of her family's history, generations of Riveras who had lived and died in this very house. She opened one at random, finding a yellowed newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Local Girls' Mysterious Death Shocks Community." The date was June 12, 1865. The photograph showed a girl who looked remarkably like her, standing beside a man whose face was obscured by shadow. He promised, the breathing seemed to say. But he lied. James discovered something in his closet, a small wooden box he didn't remember owning. Inside were letters, written in elegant script that faded even as he read them. They spoke of longing and loss, of meetings in secret places, of promises broken under duress. The last letter ended abruptly. "If you're reading this, then I have failed. Tell them what he did, tell them how he silenced me, the whispers will guide you." The room temperature plummeted, frost forming on the inside of his window. Outside, something moved between the flashes of lightning, something that shouldn't exist in this world. Find them. It breathed. All of you. The storm reached its crescendo, lightning striking the gold dome of the State House with a deafening crack. For a moment, everything went white, and when vision returned, the city seemed subtly altered. Shadows fell differently, familiar landmarks appeared slightly skewed, people walking in the streets moved as if underwater, their faces blank masks. Those who had been touched by Elizabeth's story felt the change most acutely. Their senses heightened, their perceptions expanded beyond normal limits. Sounds carried from impossible distances. Smells lingered long after their sources disappeared. Touches left imprints that glowed faintly in the dark. Andrew found himself unable to leave the cemetery. The gates had vanished, replaced by an endless expanse of tombstones stretching in all directions. Each bore Elizabeth's name, each marked a different year of death. The whispers became a chorus now, overlapping voices telling conflicting versions of the same tragedy. Some claimed she had thrown herself from the hill in despair, others insisted she had been pushed. All agreed on one thing: justice had never been served. The rain continued to fall, but it wasn't water anymore, it was memories, each drop carrying fragments of lives cut short, hopes dashed, loves lost. Madison's basement had transformed into a labyrinth of family secrets. Every box she opened contained evidence of her ancestors' involvement in Elizabeth's fate, letters of condemnation, witness statements, a blood-stained handkerchief. Photographs showing the same shadowy figure across generations, always present at moments of tragedy. The breathing grew louder, surrounding her like a physical presence. "You know him," it rasped. "He watches still." She looked up to see her own reflection in the basement window, but instead of her face, she saw the Shadow Man's features clearly for the first time. Their eyes met, and she understood everything that had been hidden, everything that had been denied. James's apartment building had emptied of all other tenants, leaving him alone with the entity that had been watching him through his cameras. The photographs on his walls had changed. Each now showed the same scene. Elizabeth standing at the edge of Copp's Hill, reaching out to someone just out of frame. The seventh figure in his broken photograph had clarified, revealing features that matched the Shadow Man from Madison's past. The wooden box had multiplied, filling his living room with identical copies, each containing variations of the same tragic story. "We are witnesses," the voice whispered directly into his mind, "and we are judged." As the supernatural storm raged, drawing energy from centuries of buried guilt and unresolved grief, the three found themselves converging at number 17 Pinckney Street. The house that had seemed merely old and empty now pulsed with malevolent life. Its windows reflected scenes from the past. Elizabeth's final moments played out endlessly, each iteration slightly different, each ending the same. The front door stood open, inviting them inside to witness the truth. The interior defied physics. Rooms stretched impossibly far, staircases led to nowhere, doors opened onto other dimensions. In the center of it all stood the Shadow Man, finally revealed in full. His face was a composite of every person who had ever turned a blind eye to injustice, every authority figure who had dismissed Elizabeth's pleas for help. "It's time," he said. his voice a chorus of thousands. Time to break the cycle. The house shook violently as reality struggled to contain the weight of so many unresolved wrongs. Andrew, Madison, and James realized simultaneously that they had been chosen not as victims, but as instruments of resolution. Each carried a piece of Elizabeth's story within them. Andrew through his ancestral connection to the hill, Madison through her family's complicity in the cover-up, James through his ability to capture truth in images. Together, they formed a conduit through which Elizabeth's voice could finally be heard, her story told in full, her justice served. The Shadow Man began to dissolve, his form unraveling like smoke caught in a strong wind. "Too late," he whispered, fragments of his essence dispersing into the ether. The truth cannot be contained. The house around them started to collapse, folding in on itself as centuries of lies unraveled. Through the destruction, Elizabeth emerged, not as a ghost, but as a manifestation of collective memory given form. Her eyes held all the sorrow of her age, yet also a spark of hope newly kindled. The storm broke as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind an eerie calm. Number 17 Pinckney Street stood intact once more, its windows dark and its for sale sign swaying gently in the evening breeze. Andrew, Madison, and James found themselves standing on the sidewalk, drenched and disoriented but whole. The whispers had ceased, replaced by the natural sounds of a city recovering from a summer storm. Lightning flashed one last time, illuminating the hilltop where Elizabeth had stood so long ago. For a brief moment, they thought they saw her silhouette against the darkening sky, her hand raised in farewell. Life in Boston returned to normal, though those who had been touched by the supernatural events carried their experiences like scars, invisible to others, but ever present in their minds. Andrew devoted himself to preserving local history, ensuring that stories like Elizabeth's would never be forgotten again. Madison worked to uncover other buried truths in her family's past, determined to break cycles of silence and denial. James continued taking photographs, but now his lens sought to capture not just images, but essences, the intangible elements that made people who they were. On quiet summer evenings, when storms gathered over the city and the wind whispered through the ancient trees, some claimed they could still hear Elizabeth's voice. Not demanding vengeance, not seeking pity, simply reminding those who would listen that truth has a way of emerging, no matter how deeply it is buried. And sometimes, when passing number 17 Pinckney Street, particularly sensitive souls might catch a glimpse of movement in an upper window or feel a gentle touch on their shoulder, accompanied by the softest of whispers, "Thank you." The story of Elizabeth Hargrove became legend in certain circles, a cautionary tale about the dangers of ignoring injustice and the power of collective memory. Her name appeared in historical records, her story told in museums and walking tours. Yet those who had truly known her, Andrew, Madison, James, understood that her presence lingered not in these official accounts, but in the spaces between them. In the moments when the world seemed to hold its breath, when shadows fell just a little too deep, when the wind carried voices from another time, Boston continued its march forward, oblivious to the thin veil separating past from present. Summer storms still rolled in from the Atlantic, lightning still illuminated the gold dome of the State House. Children still played in the shadow of Copp's Hill, unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded there so long ago. But somewhere, in the fabric of the city itself, Elizabeth's story continued to resonate. A reminder that some truths refuse to be silenced. Some voices continue to breathe long after their bodies have turned to dust. And on nights when the moon hung low over Beacon Hill, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets, those who listened closely might hear it, the whisper that breathed, carrying fragments of a life reclaimed, echoes of justice finally served. Reminders that even in death, truth finds a way to speak through those willing to listen. Screams in the warehouse at night. The winter air in Savannah carried an unusual chill, even for Georgia. The cicadas buzzed incessantly through the humid night as Amelia Thompson tightened her scarf around her neck. She had taken the security job at the old warehouse on the outskirts of town, mostly out of desperation. The building stood like a monolith against the dark sky, its weathered brick walls telling stories of better days when it was part of the thriving port district. Liam Allen, her partner for the night shift, leaned against their patrol car while chewing absent-mindedly on a toothpick. "Third week, and you're still jumpy," he said with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. His attempt at casual conversation couldn't mask the tension in his voice. They both knew something wasn't right about this place. Every night brought new sounds from within the warehouse's walls, sounds that shouldn't exist in an empty building. As they approached the main entrance, Amelia noticed the padlock looked different somehow. The scratches around the hasp seemed fresh, though she could have sworn she'd checked it thoroughly just hours before. Liam must have seen her hesitation because he placed a hand on her shoulder. "Probably just kids messing around again," he said, but his words lacked conviction. Last week, they'd found graffiti inside that definitely hadn't been there during their previous rounds. The heavy metal door groaned in protest as Liam pushed it open. The smell hit them immediately, damp concrete mixed with something metallic that made Amelia's stomach churn. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing rows of empty pallets and dusty machinery. The air felt heavier inside, pressing against their lungs with each breath. Somewhere deep in the shadows, water dripped methodically. Drip, drip, drip. They started their usual patrol route, boots echoing ominously against the concrete floor. Amelia couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. The security cameras mounted high on the walls provided little comfort. Their red lights blinked steadily, but she knew from experience how unreliable they were. Half of them were either broken or showed nothing but static-filled images on the monitor back at their station. "Did you hear that?" Amelia whispered suddenly, grabbing Liam's arm. A soft scraping sound had come from somewhere behind the rows of shelving units. It sounded like metal dragging across concrete. Slow, deliberate. Liam raised his flashlight, the beam trembling slightly despite his best efforts to keep it steady. "Probably just rats," he muttered, though neither of them believed it. The sound came again, closer this time. Closer. Their radios crackled to life without warning, making them both jump. Static filled their ears for several seconds before a distorted voice broke through. "Help me." The transmission ended abruptly, leaving only silence in its wake. Amelia and Liam exchanged a worried glance. That section of the frequency belonged to local emergency services, not their security channel. They should never have received that transmission here. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees as they continued deeper into the warehouse. Their breath formed visible clouds in the beam of their flashlights. Something moved in the corner of Amelia's vision. A shadow too large to be a rat, darting between support columns. When she turned to look directly at it, there was nothing there. Just empty space and more shadows that seemed to stretch longer than they should. Liam stopped suddenly, causing Amelia to bump into him. He was staring at something on the floor ahead. At first glance, it looked like oil stains, but as they moved closer, the metallic smell became overwhelming. Blood. Fresh blood leading toward one of the loading docks. The trail glistened wetly in their flashlight beams, ending abruptly at the edge of a large pool that hadn't been there during their last pass through this area. Neither of them spoke as they followed the path, their footsteps careful and measured. The loading dock area proved even colder than the rest of the warehouse. Condensation formed on every surface, dripping steadily from the ceiling beams. What appeared to be claw marks scored deeply into the concrete floor, radiating outward from the blood pool like some terrible flower blooming in reverse. Amelia's radio crackled again. This time with no discernible words, just a rising and falling electronic whine that set her teeth on edge. She fumbled to turn it off, but found the volume control unresponsive. Something heavy shifted in the darkness above them. The sound of movement came from the catwalks high overhead, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the metal structure. Liam's flashlight beam swept upward, catching glimpses of movement too fast to track properly. Whatever it was up there moved with unnatural speed, darting between support beams with impossible agility. The growling grew louder and closer. Amelia's training screamed at her to retreat, to get away from whatever was hunting them in the dark. But something else held her rooted to the spot, a primal curiosity mixed with terror that froze her muscles. The blood pool began to bubble softly, tiny crimson bubbles forming and popping with sickening sounds. From the corner of her eye, she saw shapes moving in the darkness beyond the loading dock doors. Too many shapes to count. The attack came without warning. One moment they were scanning the catwalks, and the next, Liam was gone. His flashlight clattered to the ground, rolling away into the shadows. Amelia heard his muffled scream cut short as something massive dragged him upward into the darkness. Her own scream caught in her throat as she backed away, tripping over her own feet in her haste to escape. The thing on the catwalk let out a triumphant roar that shook dust from the ceiling. She scrambled backward, her flashlight beam dancing wildly across the warehouse floor. More figures emerged from the shadows now, surrounding her. They moved with jerky, unnatural motions, their forms humanoid but wrong somehow, too tall, too thin, their limbs bending at impossible angles. The largest figure, presumably what had taken Liam, dropped down from the catwalk with a deafening crash. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, fixing on her with predatory intelligence. The cicadas outside had grown louder, their buzzing almost deafening now. Amelia realized with growing horror that their pattern matched the rhythm of the creature's movements. Each step it took toward her synchronized perfectly with the insect's chorus. The other figures began to circle her, closing in from all sides. Their breathing sounded wet and labored, like liquid being forced through cloth. She pressed herself against a stack of pallets, searching desperately for an escape route. A sudden noise from the office area caught everyone's attention, the distinctive sound of someone trying to force open a window. The creatures hesitated, their heads snapping toward the disturbance with unsettling speed. Amelia seized her chance, diving between two of the smaller figures and sprinting toward the main entrance. Behind her, she heard snarls of frustration as the creatures debated whether to pursue her or investigate the new intruder. Her radio crackled to life again, this time with perfect clarity. "Run!" a woman's voice shouted urgently. "Get out while you still can." The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by more static. Amelia didn't question it. She poured everything she had left into reaching the exit. As she burst through the heavy metal door, the cold night air hit her like a slap. The cicadas fell silent all at once, creating an eerie void where their buzzing had been moments before. Standing by their patrol car was a young woman, probably in her early 20s, dressed in tattered clothes and bleeding from multiple wounds. Her eyes widened when she saw Amelia emerge from the warehouse. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered hoarsely. "None of us should be here." Before Amelia could respond, the girl collapsed to her knees, pointing weakly back toward the building. "They're coming." True to her warning, the warehouse doors slammed shut with enough force to rattle the entire structure. The windows on the upper floors began to glow with an unnatural light, pulsing in time with the now returning cicada chorus. Shadows moved behind the glass in ways that defied physics, stretching and contorting until they seemed to press against the very fabric of reality. Amelia helped the mysterious girl to her feet, noticing for the first time these strange symbols carved into her arms. "We need to move," the girl insisted, pulling Amelia toward the car. "They'll be spreading soon. They always do after a feeding." Her words sent chills down Amelia's spine, not least because she realized dawn was still hours away. The temperature continued to drop, frost forming on nearby surfaces despite the humid air. The warehouse seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, its walls expanding and contracting like living tissue. As they reached the patrol car, Amelia risked one last look back. Dozens of glowing eyes stared out from the warehouse windows, watching them with obvious hunger. Something massive moved behind the glass, its silhouette too large to be contained within the building's walls. The girl shoved her into the passenger seat, taking the wheel herself with surprising strength. "Don't look back," she warned as she started the engine. "Whatever you do, don't look back until we're out of Savannah." The drive through the city streets felt surreal. Streetlights flickered erratically as they passed, and the few people still out at this hour seemed to be walking in slow motion, their faces blank and expressionless. The girl Spiel, who introduced herself only as Rachel, kept checking the rearview mirror obsessively, muttering about spread patterns and infestation zones. Amelia wanted to ask questions, but found herself unable to form coherent thoughts, let alone words. They reached the city limits just as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the horizon. Rachel visibly relaxed, though she maintained their speed well above the legal limit. "You got lucky tonight," she said finally. "Most people don't make it out of there alive, especially not after hearing the screams." Amelia opened her mouth to ask what she meant, but Rachel cut her off. "Don't worry about it now. Just know that you've been marked. They'll be watching for you, watching and waiting." The cicadas began their morning song as they left Savannah behind, their buzzing gradually fading into silence. Amelia stared at her reflection in the side window, barely recognizing herself. Her face was pale and drawn, her eyes haunted by things she couldn't yet comprehend. In the distance, church bells began to ring, their tones carrying an unexpected sense of finality. Rachel gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles white against the gathering daylight. Somewhere behind them, in the heart of Savannah's industrial district, the warehouse stood silent and still. Its walls bore fresh scratches and scorch marks that hadn't been there the night before. Inside, pools of blood slowly dried on the concrete floors, already beginning to attract flies. The security cameras remained offline, their lenses cracked and blackened. High above, on the catwalks, something waited patiently for nightfall. Something that remembered the taste of fear. Don't just watch in the dark, click subscribe, like, and join now. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? The secret without a name. The cold was biting, and the silence of Anchorage's streets at 2 a.m. felt unnatural. Amelia Mitchell pulled her coat tighter around herself as she hurried down a dimly lit sidewalk. The snow crunched under her boots, each step echoing in the stillness like an unwelcome intrusion. She shouldn't have been out here this late, but something about the call from Sophia Miller had made her stomach churn, a desperate voice pleading for help before the line went dead. Amelia's breath came out in visible puffs, quickening with every second that passed. Her gloved hands tightened around the strap of her bag as she turned onto Sophia's street. It was eerily empty. The kind of emptiness that didn't feel right even for a place buried deep in winter. Streetlights flickered above, casting long shadows on the snow-covered ground. The houses here were mostly dark, their windows staring blankly into the night, except for one, a faint light glowed behind closed curtains at the end of the block. That must be it, she thought, her heart pounding harder now. Sophia lived alone, always insisting she liked the quiet solitude of Anchorage winters. But tonight, there was no answer when Amelia knocked on the door. She tried again, louder this time, her knuckles rapping against the wood with urgency. "Sophia? Are you there?" Only silence greeted her, broken only by the distant hum of power lines swaying in the wind. She reached for her phone to call again, but just as her thumb hovered over the screen, she heard a faint creak from inside the house. It wasn't enough to dismiss as settling wood, it carried weight, purpose. Amelia hesitated, then pressed her ear closer to the door. Another sound followed, softer but unmistakable, shuffling footsteps, moving away from where she stood. "Sophia?" she called again, her voice trembling. No response. Just the oppressive silence pressing back against her words. Then, without warning, the doorknob began to turn slowly. So slowly, it seemed deliberate. Amelia stumbled backward, nearly slipping on the icy steps leading up to the porch. Her pulse roared in her ears as the door swung open wide, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. There was no one there, not immediately anyway. But as Amelia forced herself to peer inside, she noticed something odd, a trail of wet footprints leading further into the house. They weren't hers. They couldn't be. She hadn't stepped inside yet. And they weren't fresh either, not entirely. Some parts of the prints gleamed with melted snow, while others looked older, partially dried and smeared as if someone or something had walked through days ago but left traces that refused to fade. Against her better judgment, Amelia stepped inside. The warmth of the house hit her instantly, though it brought little comfort. Something about the air felt wrong, stale, heavy, as if it hadn't circulated properly in weeks. She glanced around the living room, taking in the familiar clutter of books and photographs scattered across shelves. Everything seemed normal, until she saw the photo frame lying face down on the coffee table. She picked it up cautiously, turning it over. It was a picture of Sophia smiling brightly next to Jackson Cole, her boyfriend or ex-boyfriend, depending on who you asked. Their faces were scratched out violently, gouges cutting through the glass like angry scars. A chill ran down Amelia's spine. This wasn't random vandalism. Someone had done this deliberately, methodically. Before she could process what it meant, another noise caught her attention, a low scraping coming from somewhere deeper in the house. It sounded like nails being dragged along a hard surface, slow and rhythmic, punctuated by pauses that somehow felt more menacing than the sound itself. Amelia swallowed hard, clutching her phone tightly in her hand. She considered calling the police, but what would she say? That she broke into her friend's house because of some creepy noises? They'd think she was crazy. Instead, she moved cautiously toward the hallway, following the sound despite every instinct screaming at her to leave. The hallway was narrow, lined with family portraits that seemed to watch her as she passed. Each frame held a face frozen in time, eyes staring ahead as if waiting for something. At the far end, a door stood slightly ajar, light spilling out from within. The scraping grew louder, closer, and Amelia realized it was coming from behind that door. Her palms were slick with sweat beneath her gloves as she pushed it open just enough to peek inside. What she saw stopped her dead in her tracks. The room was small, cluttered with boxes stacked haphazardly against the walls. In the center sat a chair, and on the chair was Sophia, or at least what remained of her. Her body slumped forward unnaturally, head hanging limp as if her neck couldn't support its weight anymore. Blood pooled beneath the chair, dark and congealed, staining the hardwood floor. But the worst part was her face, or rather, the absence of it. Where Sophia's features should have been, there was only smooth, featureless skin stretched taut over bone. Amelia gagged, stumbling backward as bile rose in her throat. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. Instead, she froze, transfixed by the sight before her. And then, from somewhere behind her, a voice spoke softly, almost kindly. "You shouldn't have come." She spun around, heart hammering wildly, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, the portraits still staring silently ahead. Yet the voice lingered in her mind, repeating the same phrase over and over. "You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have come." Amelia backed away, tripping over her own feet as she tried to retrace her steps toward the front door. But the layout of the house seemed different now, distorted somehow. Doors that hadn't been there before appeared in the walls, leading to rooms she didn't recognize. Shadows shifted unnaturally, twisting into shapes that defied logic. She could hear whispers now too, overlapping voices murmuring in tones too low to understand. Panic set in fully as she realized she was trapped. Every step she took led her deeper into the labyrinthine nightmare of Sophia's home. The air grew colder with each passing moment, frost creeping up the walls and forming intricate patterns on the ceiling. And always, the whispers followed her, growing louder and more insistent. Finally, she found herself in a room she didn't remember entering. It was larger than any other space in the house, impossibly so, with walls made entirely of mirrors. Each reflection showed a version of herself, but none of them matched the person standing in the center of the room. Some looked older, gaunt, and hollow-eyed. Others appeared younger, innocent, and terrified. One reflection wasn't even human. It was a twisted, monstrous figure with elongated limbs and a mouth full of jagged teeth. Before she could react, the reflections began to move independently, stepping out of the mirrors and surrounding her. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, and they all spoke in unison, their voices blending into a single cacophony. "You know the secret," they hissed. "You've always known." Amelia shook her head frantically, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know anything," she screamed. But the figures only drew closer, their cold breath brushing against her skin. One of them reached out, its fingers brushing her cheek, and suddenly memories flooded her mind, memories that weren't hers. Images of Sophia, of Jackson, of secrets whispered in the dark, of a nameless thing lurking just beyond the edge of perception, waiting patiently for someone foolish enough to stumble upon it. And then everything went black. When Amelia woke, she was outside again, lying in the snow. The house was gone, replaced by an empty lot surrounded by trees. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she fumbled to retrieve it, hoping desperately for some explanation. There was a text message from an unknown number containing only 3 words: "Tell no one." She stared at the screen, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Somewhere in the distance, she heard laughter, soft, childlike, and utterly devoid of joy. The whisper that never opened. It was 3 in the morning when Lucas Bennett first heard the sound. A faint whisper carried by the icy wind that swept through the narrow streets of Los Angeles. The city was unusually quiet for a place that never slept, its usual hum of life replaced by an unsettling stillness. Frost clung to the palm trees lining the sidewalks, their leaves glistening under the dim streetlights. Lucas had been walking home from his late shift at the diner when he noticed it, the whispering that seemed to follow him wherever he went. He pulled his jacket tighter around himself, trying to shake off the chill that wasn't entirely from the cold. The whisper grew louder as he passed an alleyway between 2 old brick buildings. It sounded like words, but nothing coherent, just fragments of syllables that danced at the edge of understanding. His pace quickened, boots crunching against the frost-covered pavement. He told himself it was just the wind playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew better. Olivia Turner lived in apartment 3B of the building where Lucas rented his studio. She had moved in 6 months ago, and they had exchanged polite greetings in the hallway occasionally. But tonight, when Lucas finally reached his floor, he found her standing outside her door, her face pale and drawn. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with her keys, dropping them twice before managing to unlock the door. Something about her demeanor made Lucas pause. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice softer than intended. Olivia glanced at him, her eyes wide with something he couldn't quite place. Fear? Exhaustion? Both? She hesitated before answering, I keep hearing things." Her voice cracked slightly. "Voices. Whispers. I thought maybe it was just my imagination." She trailed off, looking past him into the dark hallway. Lucas felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard those whispers too. Without thinking, he said, "Me too. Tonight. Outside." Olivia's expression shifted from fear to something closer to relief, though her hands still shook. "Come in," she said quietly, stepping aside. The warmth of her apartment enveloped him immediately, but it did little to ease the tension coiling in his chest. Inside, the room was small but cozy, decorated with mismatched furniture and soft lighting. A half-empty mug of tea sat cooling on the coffee table beside an open book. Olivia gestured for him to sit while she poured herself another cup. "Do you want some?" she asked, holding up the teapot. Lucas nodded, though he doubted anything could settle the unease growing inside him. As she busied herself in the kitchenette, he noticed the curtains were drawn tightly shut, despite the fact that no one would be able to see inside at this hour. The windows themselves seemed almost deliberately avoided. So Olivia began after handing him a steaming mug. "You heard them too, the whispers." It wasn't a question. Lucas took a sip of the tea. It tasted bitter, but he didn't complain.